It was just another regular afternoon, like any other. The sun was still high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Samuel Richards drove slowly into the parking lot of a small grocery store. He wasn't in any rush. He had a long day ahead of him, but this was just a quick stop. Or so he thought. His car, a sleek, shiny sports model, rolled into the lot, its smooth lines shining in the sunlight. It was hard not to notice. The deep red paint caught the eyes of everyone nearby. People couldn't help but glance. Most of them didn't know who he was, but they couldn't ignore that car. It looked expensive, out of place, almost like it didn't belong there. But for Samuel, the car didn't matter much. It was just a car to him. A means to get from place to place. He wasn't the type to show off. He didn't need to. He wasn't someone who wanted attention. In fact, he preferred to stay in the background, quietly going about his day. Yet, as he parked the car and stepped out, something about him caught the eye of a few people nearby. Maybe it was the car. Maybe it was the way he dressed. He always wore expensive suits, well tailored to fit his tall frame. His shoes were polished to a mirror-like shine. People could tell he wasn't just anyone. But still, they didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he had accomplished. They didn't know what he was about to do. Samuel wasn't your average guy. Most people didn't know this, but underneath his calm, composed exterior, Samuel held a secret, a big secret. A secret so powerful that it could shake the entire city if anyone ever found out. But for now, he was just another man in a suit. A man who kept to himself. A mystery. He walked into the grocery store, his footsteps echoing softly on the pavement. He didn't look around or pay attention to anyone. He had a purpose. A simple task. But in the back of his mind, he was already thinking ahead, wondering what the rest of the day would bring. As he pushed through the sliding glass doors of the store, he didn't notice the people watching him from a distance. A few curious glances followed him as he made his way to the produce section, picking up a few items for the week. But Samuel wasn't paying attention to them. He was used to it by now. People staring, judging, wondering. What they didn't know was that Samuel wasn't just another man in the crowd. He was something more. Something much bigger than they could ever imagine. But for now, he kept his head down, just like everyone else. In the next few moments, everything would change. It wasn't much longer before Samuel felt it. A tap on his shoulder. He turned around slowly, expecting a simple question about the vegetables he was looking at. But what he saw was something very different. A police officer stood there, his hand still on Samuel's shoulder. The officer had a stern look on his face, his uniform crisp and clean. There was something in his eyes, something that Samuel had seen before. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't respect. It was suspicion. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice firm. "Can I ask you what you're doing here?" For a moment, Samuel stood frozen. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The officer's eyes scanned Samuel up and down, almost as if he was looking for something. Something to justify why Samuel was in the store. Something to explain why he looked out of place. Samuel had been stopped before. It wasn't the first time. People often made assumptions about him. About the way he looked. About the car he drove. They saw his appearance and immediately thought they knew who he was, what he was doing. But they were always wrong. Samuel took a deep breath and smiled calmly. He had nothing to hide. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply buying groceries, just like anyone else. But he could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the judgment in his eyes. "I'm just here to pick up some groceries," Samuel replied, his voice steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound defensive. He simply stated the truth. The officer didn't seem convinced. He narrowed his eyes, almost as if he was looking for something more. Samuel could feel the tension in the air. He could feel the judgment that came from the officer's stance. The man's hand was still on his shoulder, holding him there. "Are you sure?" the officer asked, his tone colder now. "I don't recognize you. And I've never seen that car before. What's your business here?" It wasn't just the words that stung. It was the way the officer spoke, the way he seemed to question Samuel's very presence. It was the assumption that Samuel didn't belong there, that he didn't have a right to be in that store. That he didn't have a right to live in this neighborhood. But Samuel didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. The looks, the comments, the assumptions. People often judged him by the way he looked, by the car he drove, by the suit he wore. They never bothered to look closer. To see who he really was. What he had really done. And that was the problem. Samuel didn't care about their judgment. It didn't bother him anymore. He had learned to ignore it. To focus on what really mattered. What he was about to do. The change that was coming. But as he stood there, with the officer's hand still on his shoulder, Samuel knew something was about to happen. Something big. Something that would change everything. The officer wasn't the only one watching. There were others too. People in the store, people outside, all of them watching Samuel, judging him without knowing a thing about who he really was. But they would learn soon enough. They would all learn who Samuel Richards really was. Samuel's mind raced, but his face stayed calm. He had been in this situation before. People saw a man like him, someone with ambition, drive, and a mysterious air about him, and they made assumptions. They didn't look at the person beneath the clothes, beneath the car, beneath the suit. They only saw what they wanted to see, a man who didn't fit their mold. The officer's grip tightened slightly, but Samuel didn't budge. He wasn't afraid. He had faced far worse challenges in his life. This moment was just another hurdle to cross. But it would be a big one. It was the kind of moment where everything could change. The officer would either learn to respect him, or he would make a mistake that would cost him far more than he could imagine. "Is everything all right, officer?" Samuel asked politely, his voice smooth and controlled. He could tell the officer was struggling with what he had just heard. The name. The car. The face. All these pieces weren't adding up. "I don't mean to trouble you, sir," Officer Johnson said, his tone softening, but still carrying an air of suspicion. "It's just, you don't exactly look like you belong here." Samuel's lips twitched into a smile, but it wasn't a friendly one. "I assure you, officer, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The officer's eyes narrowed. He stepped back slightly, still unsure. There was something about this man, something that didn't fit his preconceived ideas about who people like Samuel should be. Samuel knew this moment would come, one way or another. His entire life had led to this point. It wasn't just the officer who had misjudged him. It was everyone. Every single person who had ever doubted him, overlooked him, or assumed he was just another man in the crowd. They would soon learn they had been wrong. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Samuel waited. He wasn't going to rush this. In his mind, he knew what would come next. The officer would either let it go, or he would dig deeper. But either way, Samuel was ready. He had lived with the quiet weight of his secret for years. It was time to let it out. Time to show the world that it wasn't the car or the suit that made him special, it was what he had built. What he had done with his life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Officer Johnson took a step back and seemed to hesitate. He fumbled with his radio for a second, his fingers hovering over the buttons as though unsure of what to do. Samuel remained still, his face betraying no emotion. It was all part of the plan. After a moment, the officer cleared his throat. "I'll need to run your ID, sir." "Just protocol." Samuel nodded, not surprised. He handed over his ID, watching as the officer took it, almost nervously. There was no reason for the officer to be nervous, of course. Samuel had done nothing wrong. But the officer had no idea who he was dealing with. No idea how wrong his assumptions had been. As the officer ran the ID through his system, Samuel noticed the subtle change in his demeanor. The officer had been skeptical at first, but now he was uneasy, maybe even slightly embarrassed. He was looking at the screen in disbelief. Samuel could see the change in his eyes. This was the moment. The moment when everything was about to shift. A few seconds passed, but to Samuel, they felt like hours. The officer stared at the screen, his face unreadable. Samuel couldn't help but smile inwardly. He knew what the officer was seeing. He knew the shock that was about to come. Officer Johnson's mouth opened slightly. His lips parted as if trying to find the right words, but they failed him. Finally, after what seemed like a long pause, he spoke. "Samuel Richards," he said, almost to himself. "The CEO of Global Enterprises." Samuel's smile grew, just a little, but it was enough. It was enough to show that he knew exactly what was happening. The officer's hand shook slightly as he looked back at Samuel. You're him? You're the CEO of Global Enterprises." Samuel didn't reply immediately. He didn't need to. His very presence spoke volumes. The officer's disbelief was palpable. There was no mistaking it now. Samuel Richards, the man who had been stopped in the grocery store, was not just another man. He was a billionaire. The founder and CEO of one of the most successful companies in the world. A man whose name was known all over the globe. And yet, here he was, standing in front of a police officer who had no idea who he was. Samuel took a step forward, breaking the silence. "Yes, that's right," he said, his voice calm but full of quiet power. "I am Samuel Richards. And you've just made a big mistake." The officer stammered, unsure of what to say. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. I just thought." Samuel held up his hand, silencing the officer. "It's all right," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You didn't know. But now you do." The officer seemed to realize the gravity of his mistake, and a flush of embarrassment crept up his neck. Samuel could see the color rising in his face. He wasn't angry, though. Not at the officer. In a way, he understood. This was the world Samuel had lived in for so long. The assumptions. The misunderstandings. The doubts. They were always there, lingering in the background. But Samuel wasn't like everyone else. He wasn't just another man in a suit. He was more than that. He had built something from nothing, created a global empire, and now it was time for the world to know. He wasn't going to let this moment pass quietly. He wasn't going to let the officer or anyone else continue to underestimate him. Samuel took a deep breath and looked the officer squarely in the eyes. "I'm going to take care of this," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "But you'll remember this day. You'll remember that you didn't recognize who you were talking to. And I'll make sure you learn a lesson you'll never forget." The officer nodded, his face turning even redder. He seemed to be at a loss for words, still processing what had just happened. But Samuel didn't give him the chance to say anything else. He turned and began to walk away, heading toward the store entrance. People were still watching, still whispering. But Samuel didn't care. He had bigger things on his mind now. This was just the beginning. As Samuel walked through the store, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. He had always known this moment would come. The moment when the world would realize who he truly was. The moment when the quiet, unassuming man in a suit would step forward and reveal his true power. And when that moment came, there would be no turning back. The world would see him for who he really was. The man who had built an empire from the ground up. The man who had fought against every obstacle and every assumption. The man who had proven that anything was possible. But for now, Samuel was content. He had made his point. He had shown the officer and the world that he was no one to be underestimated. The moment Samuel stepped out of his car, the eyes of the officers were already on him. His car, a sleek black sports car, stood out in the parking lot like a shining jewel. It wasn't just any car, it was the kind of car that made people stop and stare. But it wasn't the car that had caught the attention of Officer Johnson. It was Samuel. Officer Johnson had been patrolling the area for years. He knew every corner, every street, and most of the people who lived there. The upscale neighborhood was quiet, and he was used to seeing familiar faces, people who lived in large houses, who worked in tall buildings downtown, or who drove the expensive cars parked outside their homes. But Samuel was new. He didn't fit the image Officer Johnson had in mind for someone who should be driving that kind of car, especially not in this neighborhood. Without a second thought, Officer Johnson began walking toward Samuel. His eyes were filled with skepticism, and his hand rested on his belt, where his radio and other equipment hung. His steps were slow, measured, and filled with quiet suspicion. To anyone watching, it looked like a normal interaction between a police officer and a civilian. But Samuel knew better. Samuel had experienced this kind of moment countless times before. It was always the same. People saw him, and they judged him. They didn't see the man behind the car or the clothes. They didn't know what he had accomplished or the battles he had fought to get where he was today. They only saw what they wanted to see, a man who didn't fit their expectations. But Samuel had learned long ago to stay calm. This was just another test. Another moment to show that he was more than what people thought. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Johnson called out as he reached Samuel. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" His tone wasn't overly aggressive, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that suggested he wasn't asking out of simple curiosity. Samuel could tell that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. He had seen this look before, the look of someone who had already made up their mind. Samuel turned to face the officer, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. He smiled politely. "I'm just doing some shopping," he replied in a smooth, controlled voice. Officer Johnson nodded, but his eyes remained narrow, studying Samuel. He didn't seem convinced by the simple answer. "This your car?" he asked, gesturing to the sleek black vehicle behind Samuel. Samuel glanced back at his car, then looked at the officer again. "Yes, it's mine," he said simply. There was no need to explain further, no need to offer more details than necessary. He knew where this conversation was heading. Officer Johnson's lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't sure what to make of Samuel. The man standing in front of him didn't fit the image he had in his head of someone who owned a car like that, someone who would be shopping in this particular part of town. Something didn't feel right to him, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. "I don't mean to be rude," Officer Johnson began, his tone softening just a little, "but you don't exactly look like you belong here. What brings you to this neighborhood?" Samuel didn't flinch. He had heard similar words before, in different places, from different people. It was always the same, polite on the surface, but underneath, the question was clear. "What are you doing here? How did you get here? Why don't you fit the mold?" Samuel had spent years dealing with these unspoken judgments, and by now, he was used to it. He met the officer's gaze evenly. "I live nearby," he said. "Just a few blocks away." Officer Johnson blinked, clearly surprised. This wasn't the answer he had been expecting. "You live here?" he asked, sounding doubtful. Samuel nodded. Yes. Is there a problem? The officer paused, his mind racing. This man wasn't acting like someone who was guilty of anything. He wasn't nervous, wasn't fidgeting. If anything, he seemed completely in control of the situation. But still, something didn't sit right with Officer Johnson. Maybe it was the car, or maybe it was just the fact that Samuel didn't fit the picture in his mind of someone who should be living in this part of town. Well, the officer said slowly, it's just that I haven't seen you around here before. And, you know, we have to be careful. There's been some suspicious activity in the area. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Suspicious activity, he asked, his tone calm but with a hint of curiosity. The officer nodded quickly. Yeah, some break-ins, car thefts, that sort of thing. You understand why I have to ask these questions. Samuel understood all too well. This wasn't about break-ins or car thefts. This was about appearances. The officer had made a snap judgment, and now he was looking for a reason to justify it. But Samuel wasn't going to let it bother him. He had worked too hard, come too far, to let something like this shake him. I understand, Samuel said. But I assure you, I'm just here to do some shopping. I'm not looking for any trouble. Officer Johnson looked at Samuel for a long moment, clearly unsure of what to do next. He had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but instead, Samuel remained calm, composed. It was throwing the officer off balance. He was used to people reacting defensively, but Samuel wasn't giving him any reason to escalate the situation. Still, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He needed more information. Do you mind if I see some ID? He asked, his tone still cautious. Samuel nodded. Of course. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his driver's license without hesitation. The officer took the ID and glanced at it, his eyes widening slightly when he saw the name, Samuel Richards. He had heard that name before, but he couldn't quite place it. There was something familiar about it, but in the moment, he couldn't figure out why. Samuel Richards, Officer Johnson muttered under his breath, almost to himself. He handed the ID back, but there was still uncertainty in his eyes. All right, Mr. Richards. Everything seems to be in order, but, like I said, we've had some issues in the neighborhood lately, so we're just trying to be cautious. Samuel took his ID and slipped it back into his wallet. He could tell that the officer was still struggling with what he had just learned. His mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. But Samuel wasn't going to make it easy for him. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle situations like this was to let the other person do the work. Let them figure it out for themselves. I appreciate your concern, officer, Samuel said, his voice calm and polite. But I assure you, I'm not involved in any of the problems you're worried about. The officer nodded slowly, still not entirely convinced but unable to find any reason to press further. He stepped back, his hand no longer resting on his belt. The tension in the air began to ease, but there was still an undercurrent of suspicion, a lingering doubt that wouldn't go away so easily. Samuel stood there, waiting, watching the officer closely. He could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken judgments, the assumptions that had been made the second he stepped out of his car. But he wasn't going to let it affect him. He had worked too hard, achieved too much, to be shaken by something as simple as this. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Officer Johnson took a step back and gave a small nod. All right, Mr. Richards, he said, his voice softer now, less confrontational. I think we're done here. Have a good day. Samuel smiled politely and nodded. Thank you, officer. You have a good day as well. With that, the officer turned and walked back to his patrol car, but Samuel could feel his eyes still on him, still watching, still questioning. Even as he walked into the grocery store, he could sense the lingering doubt, the quiet suspicion that followed him. But Samuel didn't let it bother him. This was the world he lived in. A world where people made assumptions based on appearances, where judgments were made before questions were even asked. But Samuel had learned to rise above it. He had built his life, his career, his success, on defying expectations, on proving people wrong. And today was no different. As he walked through the aisles of the store, picking up the items he needed, his mind was already moving forward. The encounter with the officer was just another reminder of the challenges he faced, but it wasn't going to stop him. If anything, it only fueled his determination. He had come too far, achieved too much, to let something like this hold him back. Samuel Richards wasn't just a man in a suit driving an expensive car. He was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He had built an empire from the ground up, overcoming every obstacle that had been thrown his way. And no matter how many times people doubted him, no matter how many times they judged him, he would continue to rise above it. As Samuel left the store and got back into his car, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Officer Johnson still sitting in his patrol car, watching him. Samuel smiled to himself. Let them watch, he thought. Let them wonder. Because at the end of the day, they had no idea who they were dealing with. He started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, the engine purring smoothly beneath him. As he drove away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was just the beginning. The world might not fully understand who Samuel Richards was yet, but soon enough, they would. As Samuel calmly explained that he was simply stopping to grab some groceries, Officer Johnson wasn't convinced. The skepticism in his eyes only grew stronger, and Samuel could sense it like a shadow creeping up behind him. It wasn't the first time he had felt this, being judged, questioned, and doubted, all because of how he looked or the car he drove. But Samuel had learned long ago that remaining calm was his greatest weapon. So, he kept his cool. Officer Johnson, however, wasn't letting it go. He glanced at his partner, Officer Smith, who was standing just a few feet away. The two had worked together for years, and they often didn't need words to communicate. A single look between them was enough to know what the other was thinking. Smith gave a small nod and suddenly reached for his radio, preparing for what could come next. "I'm just doing my job," Johnson muttered under his breath. It wasn't meant for Samuel to hear, but he heard it loud and clear. It was always the same excuse, the same reasoning. Just doing my job. But Samuel had heard it all before: the whispers, the sideways glances, the hushed judgments. He had lived through the script so many times, it was almost routine by now. Almost. But today, something felt different. The air was thicker, the tension more palpable. Maybe it was because there were more eyes watching than usual. A few pedestrians were starting to slow down, their eyes darting between Samuel and the officers. Some were curious, others clearly uncomfortable. People were always drawn to a scene, and this was quickly becoming one. Samuel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he remained unfazed. He had to. This wasn't the time to react emotionally. Not yet. He had learned over the years how to read situations like this, how to play them out in his mind. He knew that a wrong move could escalate things in an instant. So, he took a slow breath and kept his expression calm. "Let me see your ID," Officer Johnson finally demanded, his tone a little sharper this time. It wasn't a question, it was an order. Samuel could see the tension building in the officer's posture, in the way his hand lingered just a little too close to his holster. Samuel nodded slightly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his driver's license without a word. He didn't want to give them any reason to feel threatened. He knew how quickly things could spiral if they felt like they were losing control. Officer Johnson snatched the ID from Samuel's hand, his eyes flicking down to the name on the card. Samuel Richards. The name sounded familiar, but it didn't click right away. Johnson furrowed his brow and handed the ID to his partner, who was already typing something into the small device clipped to his belt. As the officers busied themselves with checking his ID, Samuel glanced around. More people had gathered, though they kept their distance. Some were watching out of curiosity, while others appeared nervous. A couple of teenagers were whispering to each other, their eyes darting between Samuel and the officers. Samuel knew what they were thinking, what everyone was thinking. He had seen that look too many times. They were waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The radio on Officer Smith's belt crackled to life. A voice on the other end mumbled something, and Smith glanced at the screen in his hand. His eyes widened slightly, and he gave a quick look at Officer Johnson before turning back to Samuel. "Mr. Richards," Smith began, his voice more cautious now. "Can I ask what you do for a living?" It was a simple question, but Samuel could tell that it wasn't coming from a place of genuine curiosity. They were fishing for something, trying to piece together the puzzle they had created in their minds. They couldn't figure him out, and that made them uncomfortable. Samuel smiled politely, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm a businessman," he said simply. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any more information than necessary. He had learned long ago that sometimes, saying too much only made things worse. "A businessman, huh?" Johnson echoed, his tone dripping with skepticism. He looked Samuel up and down, clearly trying to reconcile the image of the man standing before him with the expensive car parked behind him. It didn't add up in his mind, and that made him suspicious. "What kind of business are you in?" Smith pressed, his fingers still hovering over the small device in his hand. Samuel considered his answer carefully. He could tell them the truth, the whole truth, but he wasn't sure they were ready for it. Not yet. They had already made up their minds about who he was, and no amount of explanation was going to change that. So, he kept it simple. "I own a few companies," Samuel said, his voice steady and calm. "Nothing too exciting." The officers exchanged a glance. They didn't believe him. Samuel could see it in their eyes. They were trying to figure out how a man like him, a black man in a fancy car, could possibly be telling the truth. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Not yet. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Samuel could feel the stares of the onlookers, the whispers growing louder with each passing second. The officers were clearly uncomfortable, unsure of how to proceed. They had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but Samuel was giving them nothing. He wasn't reacting the way they thought he would, and that was throwing them off. "Mr. Richards," Johnson said slowly, his eyes narrowing. "We're going to need to ask you to step over here." He gestured toward the side of the parking lot, away from the crowd that had started to form. Samuel knew what this was. They were trying to isolate him, to take control of the situation. They didn't want any witnesses in case things went south. But Samuel wasn't going to play into their hands. He had worked too hard, built too much, to let something like this bring him down. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. With a small nod, Samuel followed the officers to the side, away from the prying eyes of the crowd. As they moved, he could feel the weight of their stares on his back. The murmurs followed him like a cloud, but he didn't let it bother him. He had dealt with worse. Once they were away from the crowd, Officer Smith took a step closer, his eyes locked on Samuel's. "Mind telling us why you're driving such an expensive car, Mr. Richards?" he asked, his voice low and accusatory. Samuel met his gaze evenly. "I worked for it," he said simply. Smith's eyebrows shot up. "You worked for it?" "That's right," Samuel replied, his voice steady. "I've worked hard my whole life. I built my own company from the ground up. That car is a result of years of hard work and dedication." The officers were silent for a moment, clearly taken aback by Samuel's response. They hadn't expected him to be so direct, so calm. Most people in his position would have been defensive, maybe even angry. But Samuel was giving them nothing to work with. Johnson shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what to do next. This wasn't going the way he had expected. He had thought this would be a simple stop, a routine check. But now, he was starting to realize that there was more to Samuel than he had initially thought. "So, you own a company," Johnson said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "What kind of company is it?" Samuel smiled slightly. "I own several businesses," he said. "But the one you might have heard of is called Richards Enterprises." The moment the words left his mouth, he saw the change in their expressions. Richards Enterprises was one of the largest companies in the city, known for its success in everything from real estate to technology. It was a Fortune 500 company, and Samuel Richards was the man behind it all. For a moment, the officers were stunned. They hadn't expected this. In their minds, Samuel had been just another guy in a fancy car, someone who didn't belong in their neighborhood. But now, they were realizing that they had made a mistake, a big one. Officer Johnson cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Richards Enterprises," he repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Samuel nodded. "That's right. I'm the CEO." There was a long silence as the officers processed what Samuel had just told them. They had misjudged him, made assumptions based on his appearance and the car he drove. And now, they were realizing that they had underestimated him in a way that they wouldn't soon forget. Officer Smith glanced at Johnson, clearly unsure of what to say. They had been ready to escalate the situation, to treat Samuel like a suspect. But now, they were standing face to face with one of the most successful businessmen in the city, and they had no idea how to handle it. Samuel could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the way they were struggling to find a way out of the situation they had created. But he wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. He had spent his entire life being judged, being questioned, and now, it was their turn to feel the weight of their assumptions. "I hope this clears up any misunderstandings," Samuel said calmly, his voice smooth and controlled. "But if you need any more information, feel free to reach out to my office. I'm sure they can provide whatever you need." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly unsure of how to respond. They had come into the situation with one set of expectations, and now, they were leaving with a completely different understanding of who Samuel Richards was. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Richards," Officer Johnson finally said, his voice tight with embarrassment. "We apologize for any inconvenience." Samuel gave a small nod. "No problem," he said, though the look in his eyes told them that he wouldn't be forgetting this encounter anytime soon. As the officers walked away, Samuel stood tall, watching them go. He knew that this wasn't the last time he would face something like this. But each time, he grew stronger, more confident in who he was and what he had built. With a deep breath, Samuel handed over his ID. His movements were calm and controlled, but he could feel the tension in the air. Officer Johnson grabbed the ID with a quick, dismissive motion, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. As Johnson typed Samuel's name into the system, his face remained indifferent, the same expression of suspicion and skepticism he had worn since the beginning of the encounter. But then, something shifted. Johnson's eyes flickered to the screen, and his confident posture wavered. His fingers froze on the keyboard as the search results loaded. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes locked on the screen in front of him. The name staring back at him was one he had heard before, one that carried weight far beyond this small interaction in the grocery store parking lot. "Wait, this can't be right," Johnson muttered, his voice barely audible, more to himself than anyone else. His partner, Officer Smith, noticed the change in Johnson's demeanor and stepped closer, leaning in to glance at the screen. Samuel Richards. Johnson repeated under his breath, almost as if he couldn't believe the name he was reading. The CEO of Global Enterprises. Officer Smith's eyes widened as well. The name struck a chord, and they both stood frozen for a moment, processing the realization. The same man they had casually questioned, the man they had assumed was out of place in this upscale neighborhood, was none other than Samuel Richards, one of the most powerful business figures in the country. His company, Global Enterprises, was a giant in the corporate world, a name known for innovation and massive success. It wasn't just a company, it was a global empire, and Samuel Richards was the man at the helm. Johnson looked up, his confidence from moments earlier evaporating into uncertainty. He wasn't sure what to say now, how to act. The dynamic had shifted completely, and the realization hit him hard. He had misjudged Samuel, made assumptions based on appearances, and now he stood face to face with someone far beyond his understanding. Samuel didn't say a word. He let the silence hang in the air, watching as the officers struggled to regain their composure. He knew they were grappling with their own preconceived notions, trying to reconcile the image they had in their minds with the reality standing before them. Slowly, almost deliberately, Samuel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a business card. It was simple and elegant, the kind of design that spoke volumes without needing to shout. The card bore the logo of Global Enterprises, instantly recognizable to anyone in the business world. Samuel held the card out, offering it to Officer Johnson, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. Johnson's hand shook slightly as he accepted the card, his eyes darting between it and Samuel, his mind racing to catch up with the gravity of the situation. Samuel smiled, but it wasn't a smile of arrogance or superiority. It was a calm, composed smile, one that carried the weight of experience, of having been through situations like this before. He had seen the look on Johnson's face too many times: surprise, disbelief, and a hint of regret for having jumped to conclusions. "Yes," Samuel finally said, his voice measured and calm. "That's me. And you've just interrupted a very important meeting I was heading to." Johnson opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. The realization that they had stopped one of the city's most influential figures for no reason other than their own assumptions left him speechless. Officer Smith, standing to the side, looked equally lost for words. The murmurs from the crowd that had gathered began to die down as people started to realize what was happening. Whispers spread quickly, the name Samuel Richards passing from person to person. The crowd had been expecting something entirely different, a confrontation, maybe even a dramatic escalation, but instead, they were witnessing a revelation that none of them had anticipated. Samuel could feel the weight of their stares, but he remained composed. He had been in the spotlight before, though usually for different reasons. Today, the attention was on him not because of his success, but because of the assumptions people had made about him. And now, those assumptions were being shattered, one by one. The officers stood there, caught in the uncomfortable silence of their mistake. Samuel could see the wheels turning in their heads, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. But there was no easy way out of this. They had made their judgments too quickly, and now they were paying the price for it. "Mr. Richards," Officer Johnson finally managed to say, his voice shaking. We didn't realize who you were. We were just doing our job, you know, checking things out, making sure everything's safe around here." Samuel's smile faded slightly, his expression becoming more serious. "Doing your job," he repeated, his voice calm but with an edge of firmness. "Is this how you do your job? By stopping people who look a certain way? By assuming things about someone without knowing the facts?" Johnson swallowed hard, his face reddening with embarrassment. I didn't mean it like that," he stammered. "We didn't know." "No," Samuel interrupted, his voice steady. You didn't know. And that's the problem, isn't it? The officers fell silent again, unsure of how to respond. Samuel wasn't angry, but there was a quiet strength in his words that made it clear he wasn't going to let this slide easily. He had dealt with situations like this before, but that didn't mean it was any less frustrating. No matter how much success he achieved, no matter how far he rose, there were always going to be people who judged him based on appearances. Samuel could see the discomfort on their faces, the realization sinking in that they had made a mistake, a big one. But he wasn't interested in making a scene or dragging this out. He had too much on his plate to waste time on people who didn't know better. Look, Samuel said, his tone softening slightly. I get it. You're trying to do your job. But maybe next time, think twice before you jump to conclusions. Not everyone fits the mold you're used to. Johnson and Smith nodded quickly, eager to agree, but their embarrassment was clear. They knew they had messed up, and there was no undoing it. All they could do now was apologize and hope that Samuel would let it go. We're really sorry, Mr. Richards, Johnson said, his voice filled with regret. We didn't mean any harm. Samuel studied them for a moment, then gave a small nod. Apology accepted, he said. But remember, next time, it might not be me standing here. It might be someone who doesn't have the platform or the power to make their voice heard. And you might not get off so easy. The officers nodded again, visibly relieved that Samuel wasn't going to press the issue further. They muttered more apologies as they handed back his ID and the business card, clearly eager to end the conversation. As the officers retreated, Samuel turned his attention back to the crowd. People were still staring, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration. Some of them had recognized him now, whispering his name to each other as they watched him. Samuel didn't mind the attention this time. In fact, he welcomed it. He knew that moments like this could have a ripple effect, changing the way people thought, even if only for a brief moment. Maybe someone in that crowd would walk away with a new perspective, a little more aware of the judgments they made about others. With a final glance at the officers, Samuel slipped his ID back into his wallet and straightened his jacket. He had a meeting to get to, and despite the interruption, he wasn't going to let this moment slow him down. He had work to do, deals to close, and a company to run. But as he walked toward his car, he knew that this encounter, small as it was, had left an impression. The officers had learned something today, and maybe, just maybe, the people watching had too. Sometimes, all it took was a simple reveal to make people see things differently. As Samuel got into his car and started the engine, the low hum of the powerful vehicle filled the air. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the officers still standing where he had left them, looking a little lost. He couldn't help but smile to himself. This was just another day in the life of Samuel Richards, CEO of Global Enterprises. Officer Johnson stood there, his face flushed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but deep down, he knew. He had made a grave mistake, one rooted in assumptions that went far deeper than just this one encounter. Before Johnson could speak again, his partner, Officer Smith, leaned in and whispered, "We've heard of him. He's the founder of that Fortune 500 company, the one everyone's been talking about." Smith's words hung in the air, and the weight of the realization hit Johnson like a ton of bricks. He blinked, his eyes widening as the full gravity of the situation sank in. Samuel Richards wasn't just another person driving an expensive car in the wrong part of town. He was a self-made success story, the man behind a global empire that employed thousands of people. The kind of person whose name was often mentioned in boardrooms, on business news channels, and in conversations about power and influence. Johnson's stomach twisted with guilt. His assumptions, his quick judgment, had led to this moment, a moment he couldn't take back. He had approached Samuel with suspicion simply because of how he looked, without bothering to find out who he was or what he had accomplished. I'm sorry, Mr. Richards, Johnson stammered, his voice low, almost shaking with the weight of the apology. We didn't know. We'll handle this. There's no need for any more trouble. But Samuel wasn't looking for trouble. He never had been. Trouble had found him again. This wasn't the first time he had been judged unfairly, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Apologies were easy to give, but they didn't change the deeper problem. This moment wasn't just about a mistaken identity. It was about something much larger: the everyday struggles that people like Samuel faced, struggles that had nothing to do with who they were or what they had accomplished, but everything to do with how they looked. Samuel looked at Johnson, his eyes steady, but there was a hint of sadness behind them. Not for himself, but for the world that still couldn't see beyond the surface. He had worked hard his entire life to build something meaningful, something that would outlast him. But no matter how successful he became, moments like this reminded him that in some people's eyes, he would always be seen through a narrow lens. This isn't just about me, Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. It's about what happens every day to people who don't have the same platform I do. People who don't get the chance to prove themselves before they're judged. Johnson nodded quickly, his face still red with embarrassment. He wanted to say something, to make it right, but he knew that there was nothing he could say to undo what had just happened. The damage was already done. Samuel continued, his tone still measured, but there was a quiet power behind his words. You stopped me today because of a car, because of how I look. And I'm sure you've done it before to others. But next time, think twice. Not everyone has the opportunity to correct your assumptions. The crowd that had gathered around them was silent now, listening to every word. Some of them had probably made the same assumptions when they first saw Samuel step out of his car. But now, they were beginning to understand. This moment wasn't just about one man's experience. It was a reflection of something much deeper, something that touched the lives of countless others. Johnson swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. I understand, Mr. Richards, he said softly, though his voice betrayed his unease. It won't happen again. Samuel nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure if Johnson truly understood the depth of what he was saying. Apologies were easy, but change was hard. It wasn't enough to say the words. The real challenge was in living by them, in making sure that this kind of thing didn't keep happening to him or to anyone else. Officer Smith, who had been quiet for most of the encounter, stepped forward now, his face pale but determined. We're really sorry, he added, his voice more steady than Johnson's. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Samuel looked at both officers, his expression softening slightly. He didn't want to leave them with bitterness or anger. That wasn't who he was. But he also knew that this moment needed to be a lesson not just for the officers, but for everyone watching. I hope so, Samuel replied, his voice calm. Because next time, someone might not be as forgiving. With that, Samuel turned and walked back toward his car. He could feel the eyes of the crowd still on him, but he didn't let it bother him. He had dealt with situations like this before, and he would deal with them again if he had to. But today, at least, he had made a point that he hoped would resonate long after the crowd had dispersed. As he reached his car, Samuel paused for a moment, glancing back at the officers. They were still standing there, looking lost, unsure of what to do next. He could see the weight of their mistake settling on their shoulders, and he hoped that it would stick with them, that it would make them think twice the next time they found themselves in a similar situation. Samuel got into his car and started the engine, the low hum of the vehicle filling the air. He took one last look at the scene behind him: the officers, the crowd, the parking lot that had briefly turned into a stage for a much larger issue. Then, with a deep breath, he drove away, leaving the moment behind him. But as he drove, Samuel knew that the story wasn't over. It never really was. This was just one chapter in a much longer narrative, one that stretched far beyond this one afternoon. There would be more moments like this, more times when people judged him or others based on nothing more than appearances. But Samuel was ready. He had faced these challenges before, and he had come out stronger each time. And as he navigated the familiar streets, heading toward his next meeting, he knew that he would continue to rise above it all, no matter what came his way. For now, justice had been served, but Samuel understood that true justice went beyond one encounter. It was about changing minds, changing perceptions, and creating a world where people were judged not by the color of their skin or the clothes they wore, but by who they truly were. And that, Samuel thought to himself as he drove, was the real work, the work that he, and so many others, would continue to do, one step at a time. The officers watched as Samuel's car disappeared down the road. They stood in silence for a few moments longer, their minds still reeling from what had just happened. Johnson, in particular, felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had made a mistake, and he knew it. "We really screwed up, didn't we?" Johnson muttered, half to himself. Smith nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, we did. But let's make sure we learn from it." As they turned to walk back toward their patrol car, Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that today had been a turning point not just for Samuel Richards, but for him as well. He had learned something important, something that would stay with him from now on. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Johnson made a silent promise to himself: the next time, he would do better. He would think before he acted, and he would make sure that his judgments weren't based on assumptions. Because today, he had been reminded of something he should have known all along: people are more than what they appear to be. As Samuel stood there, watching the officers drive away, a sense of calm settled over him. The crowd, which had been buzzing with whispers and murmurs, slowly began to break apart. People who had gathered, curious to see how the scene would unfold, were now leaving, some with a new sense of awareness, others still processing what they had witnessed. There was no need for shouting or anger. Samuel had stood firm, letting his actions and presence speak louder than any argument could. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or demand respect. The truth had come out on its own, in its own time, and the power of that truth had silenced the assumptions and doubts that had filled the air just moments before. Sometimes, the world only sees what it wants to see, Samuel thought to himself, his eyes scanning the faces of the onlookers who lingered for a moment longer before moving on with their day. But one day, they'll learn the truth. And it'll be on my terms, not theirs. Samuel's words weren't just for himself, they were for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, for everyone who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. He knew that the world had a long way to go before people were truly seen for who they were, not just for what they appeared to be. But today was a step in the right direction. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the parking lot. It had been a long day, but Samuel felt a sense of peace. He had faced challenges like this before, and he would face them again. But each time, he grew stronger, more resilient. And each time, he helped others see what really mattered, not the surface, but the substance beneath. As he turned and walked toward the grocery store, Samuel knew that this moment, while small in the grand scheme of things, was part of a much larger story, his story, and the story of countless others like him. It was a story of perseverance, of quiet strength, and of the belief that, no matter how the world might try to define you, you always had the power to define yourself. Inside the store, the atmosphere was calm. People went about their business, picking up groceries, chatting with the cashiers, and carrying on with their routines. For them, it was just another day. But for Samuel, this day had been different. It had been a reminder that, even in the most ordinary moments, there was an opportunity to stand up for yourself, to remind the world of your worth. As he picked up a basket and began walking through the aisles, Samuel thought about the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy. There had been many obstacles along the way, many people who had tried to tell him he didn't belong, that he couldn't succeed. But he had proved them wrong time and time again. And today was no different. He passed by a young man who gave him a nod of respect. Samuel smiled back, knowing that the interaction, while brief, carried a weight that words couldn't express. Respect wasn't something that could be demanded, it was earned. And Samuel had earned it, not just today, but through years of hard work, determination, and integrity. The soft hum of the store's air conditioning filled the background as Samuel continued down the aisles, picking up items for his home. He felt a sense of satisfaction, not just from the groceries he was gathering, but from the knowledge that he had once again faced down prejudice and come out stronger on the other side. As he reached for a carton of milk, a small child, no more than 6 years old, looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. The child's mother gently pulled him along, but the boy kept staring at Samuel, as if he saw something special in him, something that the world often missed. Samuel smiled warmly at the boy, a reminder to himself that the future still held hope. Children, after all, were not born with prejudice. They learned it from the world around them. And maybe, just maybe, moments like the one that had just unfolded in the parking lot could help change that world, one person at a time. He paid for his groceries and walked out of the store, his steps steady and sure. The sky was a deepening shade of orange, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air on his face. It was a good day, despite the challenges. And he knew that tomorrow would bring more opportunities to keep moving forward, to keep breaking down barriers, to keep proving that true power came from within. As he reached his car and loaded the groceries into the trunk, Samuel took a moment to reflect on how far he had come. From humble beginnings, he had risen to the top of the business world, not by luck, but by sheer grit and determination. He had built an empire, not just for himself, but for the people who believed in him, who had supported him along the way. He got into the driver's seat and started the engine, the soft purr of the car a comforting sound. Samuel glanced in the rearview mirror and saw his reflection, a man who had been through it all and had come out stronger because of it. But this wasn't the end of his journey. Far from it. There was still so much to do, so many people to inspire, so many barriers to break down. Samuel knew that his success wasn't just for him, it was for all the people who looked up to him, who saw in him a possibility, a dream that they too could achieve. As he drove away from the grocery store, the last of the sun's rays glinting off the hood of his car, Samuel smiled. The road ahead might be long, and there would be more challenges to face, but he was ready for them. He had always been ready. Because at the end of the day, Samuel knew one simple truth: success wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about the journey, about the lessons learned along the way, and about the impact you made on the world around you. And Samuel Richards was determined to make his impact, one step at a time. The officers, meanwhile, sat in their patrol car, both lost in thought. The weight of what had just happened settled over them like a heavy fog. Johnson, especially, felt a deep sense of shame. He had made a mistake, one that couldn't be undone. But maybe, just maybe, he could learn from it. Maybe he could be better. "We have to do better," Johnson said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Smith nodded in agreement. "Yeah. We do." They sat in silence for a few more moments before finally driving off, the lessons of the day sinking in. This wasn't just about one man, one mistake. It was about a system, about attitudes and assumptions that had been ingrained for too long. But as they drove into the fading light of the evening, Johnson made a promise to himself: he would change. He would work to see people for who they truly were, not just for what they appeared to be. And that, he hoped, would be the first step towards something better. Samuel, now miles away from the store, felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had faced down another challenge, and he had come out stronger. But more importantly, he had stayed true to himself. He hadn't let the world's assumptions define him. And that, he knew, was the key to true success. As he drove into the twilight, the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky above, Samuel smiled to himself. The journey wasn't over yet. There was still so much more to do. But for now, he was content. Content in the knowledge that he was making a difference, one step at a time.